cleared projects was 1,83,000 crore rupees, thundered former Finance Minister Paraya Panchadambaram way back in August of 2013. Much has happened since, including a historic change in government, and yet most of these projects are still to take off just because they are stuck in red tape.
So it shouldn't surprise anyone that India ranks 142 in the World Bank report on ease of doing business. We score pathetically when it comes to enforcing contracts. Prime Minister Modi has pledged to fix the mess and take India's rank to the top 50. Is that easier said than done in a country where red tape and corruption is probably institutionalized? Can Modi cut this red tape? That's the budget debate tonight. And we've got a very special panel joining in this evening. BK Chaturvedi, Sanjeev Aga, Banmali Agrawala and Mythili Bhusnurmath. Thank you so much for joining in this special debate. Mr. Agrawala, I have to start with you because you have your skin in the game. GE, as we all know, is hugely invested in India. You've recently opened another manufacturing outfit in Pune as well. Tell us, how easy is it to do business in India?
Well, I mean, there's always, Sandeep, there's always room for improvement. There are a number of things that could be naturally, made simpler, faster and speedier. But I think, it's also important for us to look at things in perspective. If you kind of go around the world, there are many places where it is really difficult to do business. There are issues ranging from physical security to currency convertibility, etc. The point I'm making is that I think as long as the price at the end of the day is more than the pain that you suffer on account of difficulty in doing business, I think, people will still be doing business. So I think one has to look at it in that perspective. But of course, as you said, Sandeep, I think there are a number of ways in which we could certainly, kind of make kind of doing business in India simpler and faster.
Fair point indeed. It really is weighing out the pain versus the prices. But Mythili, if I may come to you, we are one of the fastest growing economies in the world. We are an emerging market darling, and then we rank 142 on the list of ease of doing business in the world. We must be getting some things horribly wrong here.
Well, certainly we are getting many things wrong. But as Mr. Banmali Agrawala said, that if the pain of doing all this is, much less and the gain at the end of it all, then maybe it still makes sense to come into India. And I think that really is the bottom line, because the kind of market that you have, the kind of demand that you have for the products of almost virtually anything in the world that is manufactured or even services, I think that's what makes companies keep wanting to come into India and suffer the pain. So despite the red tape, at the end of it, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and that's what makes people come again and again and put up with all the headaches of the red tape.
Are you going to be this generous? Because, let's face it, some of our rankings are really poor when it comes to enforcing a contract. We are ranked at what, 186 or something? Ease of doing business, year after year, the ranking doesn't improve. It's a nightmare doing business in this country, isn't it?
Sandeep, I'll give you a two-faceted answer, because I think India is a very two-faceted economy. There are many parts of the economy. For example, I worked in luggage, in toys, in paints. Banmali spoke about, electric, manufacturing, and a lot of services. Things are difficult in India, particularly if you're a small business, you don't want to enter because you can't cope with the red tape. But larger companies and larger investments have people who take care of the red tape. So there, I think this is a problem, but this is not a showstopper. But let me just break away from these kinds of sectors, come to where the show has really stopped for the last 5, 6, 10 years. Let me come to infrastructure. And here, it requires surgery. There are fundamental problems. They are called red tape, but in my opinion, these are not red tape. The deep-rooted, the root cause analysis is far deeper and far more sinister.
There are serious problems, and we'll discuss them one by one, but I first want to understand, where does the blame lie? And let's understand it from the man who's been there, done that, and who perhaps understands the system a lot better than all of us here. Mr. Chaturvedi, let me ask you this question. Who is to be blamed for this pathetic ease of doing business? Is it the central government? Is it the state government? Is it politics, or is it courts?
Well, I think a lot of it, I don't want to apportion the blame, but the fact is that a lot of the factors which constitute ease of doing business lie in the domain of the state government. But there are a few laws which lie in the domain of the central government. For example, ease of implementing the contract or ease of winding up businesses. Now, these are laws which are very much within the domain of the central government, and these laws need to be modified, changed. I'm sure that now that the Prime Minister has set up a group which is working on this. So this is, first of all, first round I will say that this is how the apportion of the share of the responsibilities is.
Mythili, Mr. Chaturvedi spoke about enforcing contracts. What's the problem here? Why is it so difficult for the state, whether it's the central government or the state government, why is it tough for state to enforce contract? Is it because policies are not quite black and white, that there are, if I may take the luxury of saying so, more than 50 shades of grey here?
Well, partly because contracts are not very well drawn, because many of the Indian businesses in particular, and this is particularly true of Indian businesses, they're not very comfortable, they don't have much experience of drawing up contracts, especially with it when the other partner is a multilateral JV partner. So in the case of contracts with JVs, which are foreign partners, the Indian party is often handicapped because they don't have much experience. So the contracts themselves very often are flawed. Secondly, our entire legal system, it takes so many years before anything moves. And because though much as we pride ourselves on the right of every Indian to approach courts, yes, it is very important, and yes, it's important that we have the right to move courts through a writ petition, but that often becomes a reason to kind of prolong things, and the matters drag on in courts for almost endlessly. So that becomes a very difficult matter for any kind of business to proceed, do business quickly, because courts want quick decisions, because any time that the justice delayed is not just justice denied, but it's also huge amounts of money that is lost. So I think that becomes a huge issue. We're not able to enforce contracts. That really becomes a big problem. But as Mr. Chaturvedi said, there are different states, and the level of economic freedom in each state varies very widely.
I like the point you're making about judicial reforms being a part of cutting the red tape. But Mr. Agrawala, if I may come to you, you've got an experience working both in a multinational as well as a big private sector group here in India. Are the rules and is the ease of business norms different from a multinational to, say, a private company? I mean, look at how a Shell or even a Vodafone, for that matter, has had to wade their way through New Delhi.
Well, I think the rules, or let's say the treatment, is pretty much the same. But let me just kind of come back to a point that Mr. Chaturvedi was making earlier. I think if you look at the way, so first, let's take a step back. Most of the procurement in the country, and particularly when it comes to infrastructure and large projects, is done by the government. And most of the litigation, I think, if you see in the country, is with the government. So there's something to do with the way the government contracts. And I think if you take a look at the manner in which tenders are composed, contracts are formulated, etc., there is very little room or very little scope left for any discussion or debate, given the extreme scrutiny that everyone is now, particularly in government, that has to go through. And I would argue that if we need to look at speed and ease of decision making, then I think we've got to allow for a certain amount of discretion and judgment that needs to be exercised by the people who are in position of authority in the government. As far as the private sector is concerned, I would also say that it's pretty much common, how should I say, way of doing business, that you first enter into a contract, you enter into an engagement with the government, and then one would kind of look at how do you get the so-called price variation on account of jobs, increase in scope of work, etc., which seems to be the modus operandi of actually executing a government contract. Now, this certainly cannot be the way of working with government, and certainly not when the government is, as I said earlier, the bulk, how should I say, tenderer or procurer of equipment and services. So I think we've got to work at both ends. The government to have a little more discretion and exercise of judgment, and I think for the private sector to not rely on future changes to kind of make good let's say the business that they would like to conduct themselves in.
Mr. Aga, comment on that, because I'm curious to know what you have to say about this point of discretion and the government being able to exercise judgment, because the problem is when the government has discretion, especially in sectors like telecom and some of the infrastructure sectors, that if the moment you give discretion to the government, they almost invariably falter as far as a policy framework is concerned. Is it best that we give the discretion, or is it best that we take away the discretion from the government?
Okay, now let me expand on the point you've made. I'll be a little long-winded, but just bear with me. For the last few days, I've been, something hit me just like a ton of bricks, because I've been watching, say, telecom for years and writing about it. And it suddenly occurred to me that, today we have in India a telecom regulator who this year in my considered opinion, and I have fair acquaintance with regulation across the world, would be comparable with the best regulators in the US, in the UK like Oftel, or in various Western European countries. It's not common, but we have a situation like that. And we have a regulator like that who is far-sighted, who knows what's in the national interest, who understands the sector. It's a complex sector. All the government has to do is to follow the regulator. Now just leave that aside for the moment, you just don't follow him. Now you've got a government department, the Department of Telecommunications. Not one person in that Department of Telecommunications is equipped to do a regulatory job or a governance job. None of them has familiarity with the sector. They've never worked in the sector. They are not trained in economics. They are not trained in policy. They are fine people, but they have not been trained for a complex subject. If you take a person like me and ask me to do something in molecular biology, what do you expect? So this is what we have, and neither is there any competence in the Ministry of Communications. So we have a very funny situation that the competent are brushed aside. People who are unfamiliar with the subject are taking decisions, and if I may be a little indiscreet, with the recklessness, because they have no stake in the outcome. So the point I'm trying to make is, in all these sectors, that when you come to power, I'm glad that in some of the sectors the Modi government has got some better ministers compared to the UPA. But my fear is that ministers are not the solution to the problem. Most of these complex sectors require specialist governance institutions, and the government has no intention of building that. And so we will keep thinking, to answer your question whether there should be or there should not be discretion, my answer is yes, but not with these set of people.
Fair point indeed. I do have a answer that I want to take with Mr. Chaturvedi, but we've got to take a quick breather here on this show, come back and discuss a lot more. Single window clearances, can that be a reality in India? All right, let's begin this leg of the discussion and the debate with Mr. Chaturvedi. Mr. Chaturvedi, before we slipped into the break, Mr. Aga was making this point about having subject matter experts take decisions which are discretionary in nature. The question really is, how can discretion be taken away? The whole norm of a file tossing from one department to the other. Can we have deemed approvals? If an approval doesn't come in time, should that be deemed as an approval that has been given? Is that something that we will see unfold in India? Is that something that is required to cut the red tape?
While avoiding discretion in the government, the worry is that our current laws on the way we treat corruption, these are absolutely absurd. All over the world, corruption is treated as one where you give certain benefits, and in lieu of it you have certain advantages. It's a quid pro quo. In India, it is that there is certain rule, and if you have violated it, or it is felt that that's not been adopted, then the person is considered corrupt. Now, in case you give discretion, the worry is that all such persons who exercise discretion would be living in Tihar jail. So unless we change these laws on corruption and understand that these are complex subjects, discretion has to be exercised. And number two, you must have persons of intellectual integrity, people who are able to withstand the pressures, the political pressures, the pressures of various businesses. They're able to exercise intellectual integrity. Right. These are both very difficult things to have, but in case you have that, I would fully agree that you cannot really have a straight-jacketed laws and rules and implement it. Otherwise, you would put the whole thing in a machine, and the machine will tell you the result. So right. I would agree that it is essential, but only if we are able to do these conditions.
Sure. I'm glad you brought up the issue of corruption as well, Mr. Aga. I know that's something that you're passionate about. How do we solve this? Who is to blame for this menace? Are we to blame impatient businessmen who kind of bribe their way through the system, or is it the fact that we have a system that just doesn't deliver results, that it just takes years and years to get approvals, and so there's no other way to do business than to bribe through the system? Who's to blame?
Well, again, Sandeep, I come back to my rather oversimplified thesis. But just consider, why is it that India is almost world class, if not world class, in several industries? because where there is very little interface with this kind of government arbitrariness, you will find that you're getting the finest quality of capital flowing in, the finest quality of entrepreneurship, and the finest managers in a competitive environment. And there are many examples where India is almost world class, if not actually the best in the world. And why is it that we are so backward in so many other sectors that we are as bad as sub-Saharan Africa? And it comes back to this, because if you have those kinds of conditions, then you attract a certain kind of capital, a certain kind of entrepreneur, and you repel the better kind of managers. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have a broken down system, you will attract only a certain kind. Now just let me ask you a question. What kind of businessman who does not already have a stake will ever enter the real estate business, say in a city like Bombay or Delhi? And you have your answer. It just attracts us. Now there could be many people who are in it already, and they may be respectable and can't get out, and that may be true of many sectors. But you do no longer attract energy, you no longer attract capital, and then you attract those kinds of people, and then you will say, oh, private sector is corrupt or government is corrupt. It's just someone has to cut this Gordian knot. And the problem is, the answer is not that is there a single window, is there red tape. You have to address the root of the problem, and only then will these things vanish. I used to go to government departments 20 years ago when I was a young man, not a young boy. I never faced anything like this. You could go and talk to a secretary, the government of India, and he never had fear. He would give they were people of integrity. Why is it that it is so difficult today?
Let's move the discussion to a very painful point, and that, of course, is taxation here in India. Mr. Agrawal, if I may come to you. We talk about tax issues and we talk about arbitrariness there and all of this, but the government is very well intended, at least right now. Look at the move that they've made with the transfer pricing case of Vodafone, which is going to apply to every other case like that. So it's a well-intended move, but that doesn't seem to resonate with the taxman at the lower level. Why is there a disconnect? Do you believe, A, there is a disconnect because the situation on the ground is not something that New Delhi here is talking about?
Well, so I'd say, again, one does see a certain shift, because at the end of the day, the person who's on the ground from the tax department will pretty much, to my mind, I think, follow the direction or the instructions that he's getting from the top in terms of, do you want to increase revenue? Do you want to meet certain targets by a certain date? Or what is it that is driving that behavior? More often than not, I think it is a certain pressure or certain drivers from the top. So I would believe that things have changed, but I would still say that things have not changed enough. It's a question, again, of how aggressively do you look at taxation? Is there certainty of taxation? And by the way, this is not just taxation by the tax authorities, but if you look at the entire ecosystem, if you have a system whereby you can overturn or reverse decisions that have been made with retrospective effect, no matter which quarter they come from, I think that will make investors, and particularly foreign investors, rather uneasy.
And I don't think, to be fair, the government hasn't done enough on on the retrospective tax. The last budget was a big disappointment. Mr. Chaturvedi, probably you can comment on that. You probably understand why is there such a big disconnect between what the government says and what the government ends up doing.
Well, I'm afraid the intentions are very good when we start with this, that we would like to not have retrospective taxation, and when we see that cases like Vodafone, where the courts have held some things and we would now like to nullify in a way the orders of the court by having amendments in the laws. So the intentions are very good in the government. Everyone feels that no, this will really impact on the investments in the economy, and therefore we should not really go by this path. But as we go along and we find that there are certain cases already in the court, and how do we handle such cases? So for prospective laws they can make, and they can give all the right noises, and the people feel happy about that. But when you want to give a certain retrospective effect to your decision for cases which are already pending in the court, quite often there is a worry that people may allege that this has been done because of the corrupt behavior or because of certain things. And quite often in our country the atmosphere gets so vitiated when such large sums are involved and the politicians are involved, that people are worried to take such tough decisions. So quite often, actually, that is one factor. And the second point which was raised is that quite often when you see your revenues and you find that no, you raise the buoyant revenues, you say, okay, let this go, let this money come. I think that also is slightly also behind at the back of your mind when you take some of these decisions. That is a factor which I think they would have to, government will have to be very clear that once you have taken a decision, then it must be implemented through and through, and even if the revenues are going down, then you must have fresh taxation, but not on the other one.
Fair point indeed. Time just left for closing comments. Mr. Agrawal, I'll begin this round with you. The Prime Minister has spoken about moving from 142 to a 50. Do you see this happening in the term of this government or even in our lifetime?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I don't know about whether the term of this government, but I think it certainly is possible. Again, I'd repeat where I started, which is that I think if the size of the prize at the end of that pain or difficulty is big and large, I'm sure the private sector and industry, and particularly multinationals, will endure the pain. There is no part, no region in the world where you don't have a certain degree of difficulty in doing business. It's just a question of grades. And secondly, I would say that to my mind, it is very difficult to completely eliminate the room to exercise judgment and discretion if we want to speed things up. I think the key term over here is speed. And if we want to make sure that things happen fast, then I think we've got to allow room for judgment and maybe at times even for errors to take place. We can't, as Mr. Chaturvedi explained very well, we can't straitjacket things to such a degree that there is absolutely no room to move around. And by the way, just one last point I'd make, especially when we're talking about long-term power purchase agreements or long-term public-private partnerships, where things may change after a term of 15, 20 years, there's got to be room to sit down again and relook at things in a changed context. Without that possibility, I'm afraid we're going to be very severely straitjacketed.
Mr. Aga, comment on that. I'm not very optimistic on the system changing. I'm reasonably optimistic on things getting better, but I'm not optimistic on the system changing, which is what you think is needed for us to really improve drastically. Is that fair?
Sandeep, I don't know, you described me as a cynic. I'm not a cynic, I'm a very positive guy. I'm oversimplifying, but I find the problems rather simple. I think there are 5 or 6 big sectors which any one of them can make a huge difference to the economy. I'll name just 2 or 3 of them: railways, power, coal, telecommunications, education, maybe 1 or 2 others. You pick up even 1 or 2, fix 1 or 2, it makes a huge difference to the economy. Other problems in comparison, taxation, this is point number 1. Point number 2 is, at the end of the day, people put their faith in human beings or a system. You're not going to wear this cross on your forehead all your life about double taxation, but you would like to have the assurance. Now let me again take the example of, say, the power sector, where the minister is making strenuous efforts to fix things after the disaster we've seen in the last few years in coal and power and energy. But the problem with investors is going to be that this minister goes, you might have someone else, God knows how he will be. Just imagine if you had someone like the equivalent of a Dr. Raghuram Rajan, and you believe there is a regulatory, after all, what is the RBI? It's just a regulator who reports to the finance minister. You just have a system like that of competent, impartial people. All these worries will fade away because you have the confidence that you have a genuine problem, there's someone you can go to. I'm taking names like Raghuram Rajan. I don't mean him as an individual, I mean an institution. This is what we need to do. Then all these other issues, I think, will relatively become BC category issues. This is the heart of the problem. You can dig yourself in like an ostrich, but unless you fix this, you're going to have serious problems.
Mythili, I'll let you have the last word on this. You cannot afford to dig yourself like an ostrich when the country is at a rock bottom 142. Where would you want us to be? Do you believe 50 is achievable?
Well, 50 I don't think is, and I have no compulsions in saying that yes, I am a cynical journalist, but my cynicism is born of a fair amount of realism. I feel the cynicism is warranted because of what we've seen. At the same time, I do think things will improve, and perhaps we won't get in from a red tape is what Mr. Modi described, converting it into a red carpet. That might not happen, but I have one reason why I'm a little bit more hopeful on this reason, or for the reason that, unlike in the UPA government, where you have found different cabinet ministers speaking in different voices, the present form of government is very centralized. One understands that the PMO is taking most of the decisions. So in that case, if Mr. Modi really wants to cut the red tape, I think he has the force and the authority, and I don't think there will be enough dissenting voices to ensure that he succeeds. So I am a little hopeful. If not 50, certainly somewhere near 100, I think is possible.
All right, so the reality lies in those numbers. From a 142 or 50, can Mr. Modi take us there? Investment climate in India will have to change, and for that to happen, the red tape will have to be cut. Remember, for all of that, growth has to be non-negotiable, and Mr. Modi has to wade his way through. And like he's promised to the electorate, minimum government and maximum governance. Sandeep?
That's right. The transition from red tape to red carpet. It's going to be a fascinating one. Hopefully, we'll do a debate after that transition is made as well on what got us there. Mr. Agrawal, Mr. Aga, Mr. Chaturvedi, and Ms. Mythili, thank you so much for joining in on this edition of the Budget Debate. Appreciate you joining us right here on ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.